Right now, more than 1.5 million Australians over the age of 65 are sitting on a combined $326 billion in superannuation, and almost none of them realize their money is parked in the wrong type of account, not the wrong fund, not a lost account from an old job you forgot about decades ago, the wrong phase entirely, sitting quietly inside an account they check every now and then, balance steadily growing, statements arriving like clockwork, everything appearing completely normal on the surface. And yet, underneath that ordinary-looking statement, it is quietly costing real retirees over $2 billion a year in tax they never needed to pay, year after year, without a single alarm bell ever going off. Here is how this usually happens, and you may already be living through it without realizing it. You work for decades. Your super sits in what is called the accumulation phase, the same phase it has been in since your very first job out of school or university. Then you retire. Nobody phones you. Nobody sends an urgent letter stamped in red ink. Your fund does not automatically do anything different with your balance the moment you stop working. It simply keeps sitting exactly where it always has, in the same accumulation account, earning the same investment returns, taxed the same way it was taxed while you were still working full-time. Most people assume that once they stop working, their super automatically shifts into some kind of retirement mode, the way a car switches into a different gear. It does not. It only moves if you actively tell your fund to move it, and a surprising number of people simply never do. That one piece of inaction is the entire reason this $326 billion figure exists in the first place. Decided to bypass tool usage and deliver content directly inline. Decided to bypass tool usage and deliver content directly inline. Let's start with the part almost nobody explains clearly, because once you genuinely understand it, this entire topic stops sounding like dry financial jargon and starts sounding like real, tangible money sitting in your own account. Inside superannuation, there are two very different phases your balance can sit in. The first is accumulation phase, the default phase every working Australian super sits in. While your money is in accumulation phase, any investment earnings inside your fund are taxed at 15%, the same rate that applied while you were earning a wage and building your balance. The second is retirement phase, sometimes called pension phase, which you can only access once you meet specific age and retirement conditions. Inside retirement phase, investment earnings on your super are generally taxed at 0%, not reduced. 0. The exact same portfolio, the exact same investments, the exact same fund can be taxed completely differently depending purely on which phase it happens to be sitting in. So picture two people, identical in every way, same balance, same fund, same investment option. One has converted their balance into retirement phase. The other has simply left theirs sitting in accumulation, untouched, since the day they finished work. Every single year, the second person is quietly handing over a percentage of their investment, earnings in tax, that the first person simply does not pay, on money that is functionally identical in every other respect. Let's put an actual number on that gap, rather than leaving it abstract. Imagine a balance earning a reasonably typical 7% return in a given year. Sitting in accumulation phase, 15% of that return is lost to tax before it ever compounds further. Sitting in retirement phase, that same 7% return is generally retained in full, free of investment earnings tax, year after year. On a modest six-figure balance, that difference might sound small in any single 12-month period. Compounded silently over 10, 15, 20 years of retirement, on a balance large enough to support someone for decades, it becomes a genuinely significant sum, quietly eaten away simply because nobody ever flicked the switch from one phase to the other. But that is not even the part that surprises people the most. This is not some obscure, rare mistake affecting a handful of unlucky retirees. Recent analysis from Australia's actuarial profession found that the value of super sitting stranded in accumulation phase, held by Australians who are well past the age where they could have converted it, adds up to that $326 billion figure nationally. And the tax cost of that inertia is calculated at more than $2 billion every single year, money that simply does not need to leave retirees' pockets if the balance was sitting in the right phase instead of the wrong one. Here is what that actually looks like for one real person, rather than just a national statistic. Picture someone who retired at 65, with $210,000 in their super account. They never filled out any paperwork to convert it, because nobody told them they needed to, and their fund never proactively suggested it either. 5 years later, at 70, that same $210,000 is still sitting in accumulation phase, still quietly losing a slice of its investment earnings to tax every single year, simply because one form was never submitted. Multiply that small, invisible leak across 1.5 million retirees, and you get exactly the kind of number that should genuinely concern policymakers and individuals alike. Here is the part that surprises even people who think they already understand how superannuation works. The fix for this, for most people, is not complicated, expensive, or restricted to the wealthy. It typically involves contacting your super fund and starting what is called an account-based pension, sometimes called a retirement income stream, using some or all of your existing balance. Once that conversion happens, the same money, the same investments, start earning largely tax-free returns instead of being taxed at 15%, and you also begin receiving a regular income stream from your balance, rather than letting it sit completely untouched. One real case study, modeled by actuaries, shows a 65-year-old with $450,000 converting their balance into this kind of pension, drawing only the legally required minimum amount each year, and placing that income into an ordinary savings account, earning a modest return. After 5 years, they are already better off than if they had simply left the same balance, sitting in accumulation phase, doing nothing. Run the comparison out further, even assuming they actually spend $20,000 a year from that pension rather than saving it, and the advantage of having converted continues for close to 3 decades. This is precisely why the system is now actively being redesigned around this exact problem. There is a proposal currently being discussed within the superannuation industry, sometimes referred to by the working name MyIncome, which would see funds automatically default members into this kind of retirement income arrangement from age 65, rather than waiting for every single person to fill out paperwork they may never even know exists. Under that proposal, anyone who still has not converted by age 75 would have their remaining balance automatically shifted into the more tax-effective phase, regardless of whether they ever got around to asking. As part of preparing for this shift, funds would also begin collecting members' bank account details earlier, from around age 60, specifically so the system is ready to start paying an income the moment someone reaches retirement, without months of administrative delay. None of that proposal is law yet. It remains a recommendation, not a current rule, and there is no guarantee of exactly when, or whether, it gets implemented in its current form. But here is the genuinely important part for you, watching this today. You do not need to wait for any of that legislation to pass in order to fix this for your own super, right now, if it applies to your situation. There is one important detail worth understanding before you make that call, because it affects how much of your balance you might actually want to convert. There is a limit, known as the transfer balance cap, on how much super you can move into the tax-free retirement phase across your lifetime. Balances above that cap can still exist, but the portion above it generally needs to remain in accumulation phase, still subject to the 15% earnings tax. For the vast majority of everyday retirees, with balances well under that cap, this is barely relevant, and the bulk of their balance can simply convert across. But if you are fortunate enough to have built a particularly large balance, it is worth knowing that there is a ceiling on how much of it can benefit from the zero tax treatment, which is exactly the kind of detail your fund or a financial advisor can quickly clarify for your specific situation. It is also worth knowing that once money sits in retirement phase, you generally cannot continue making new contributions directly into that same pension account, which is why many people choose to convert once they have genuinely finished working, rather than while still receiving employer contributions. Let me walk you through how this plays out for 2 different real Australians. Picture someone who retired several years ago with a modest, completely ordinary super balance, who assumed, reasonably enough, that simply stopping work was the end of the process. They had worked hard for over 40 years, raised a family, paid off a home, and when retirement finally arrived, they were, understandably, focused on adjusting to a completely new daily routine rather than chasing down superannuation paperwork. Nobody from their fund called to explain account-based pensions. They never asked because they did not know there was anything to ask about, and their annual statement, glanced at briefly each year, never once flagged that anything was amiss. Every single year since, a portion of their investment earnings has quietly disappeared in tax that a 5-minute phone call could have eliminated entirely. They are not reckless or careless. They simply fell into the exact gap this entire system was never properly designed to catch. Now picture a second person, similar age, similar balance, who happened to mention their retirement plans to a friend who had already gone through the exact same process 2 years earlier. That single, almost accidental conversation over a cup of coffee prompted a phone call to their fund, a short form, a brief chat with a staff member about their options, and a conversion into an account-based pension within a matter of weeks. From that point forward, the same balance, the same investments, simply stopped losing the same slice to tax every year, and started providing a structured, regular income instead, deposited automatically into their bank account, on a schedule they chose themselves. The only real difference between these two people was not luck, intelligence, or wealth. It was simply whether someone happened to mention this one specific detail to them at the right moment. So here is what actually matters for you, right now, whether you are already retired or getting close to it. First, if you are over 60 or already over 65 and retired, contact your super fund directly and ask one simple question. Is any part of my balance still sitting in accumulation phase? And would I be eligible to convert some or all of it into an account-based pension? This single question, asked plainly, often reveals more than years of assuming everything is balanced, automatically being handled correctly on your behalf. Most major funds can answer this within a single phone call, and many can walk you through the phone call in a money mutually on Shies in the same conversation if you decide to proceed. Second, if you are approaching retirement but not quite there yet, ask your fund what the actual process looks like the moment you do retire, rather than discovering the paperwork exists only after months have already passed with your balance sitting untouched. Many funds now have a dedicated retirement team specifically for this conversation, separate from the general member services line, and asking for that team directly often gets you a more detailed, relevant answer. Third, if you have a parent, an older relative, or a retired friend who has never specifically discussed this with their fund, this is exactly the kind of detail worth mentioning to them directly. For many retirees, the only thing standing between them and a meaningfully better tax outcome is simply someone telling them this conversation needs to happen. Given how this entire situation began, with one quiet conversation between friends, you genuinely never know whose retirement you might be improving simply by raising it once, in passing, the next time the topic of retirement comes up. Fourth, when you do speak with your fund, ask specifically about the minimum drawdown, requirement that applies to account-based pensions, the smallest amount you are required to withdraw each year once converted. Many people assume converting means losing control of their money or being forced to spend it quickly, when in reality the minimum is simply a percentage of your balance, often a modest one in the years immediately following retirement, and you remain free to draw more if you genuinely need it, or simply let any excess continue building inside the account. None of this requires aggressive investment changes, complicated strategies, or significant financial risk. It is, for most eligible people, a conversation and a form, nothing more dramatic than that. But multiplied across 1.5 million Australians, that simple conversation represents over $2 billion a year, sitting quietly in the wrong place, purely because the system was built to require action, rather than to take it automatically. It is worth sitting with why this particular gap has been allowed to grow so large in the first place. Superannuation in this country was originally designed almost entirely around the accumulation years, the decades of steadily building a balance while you are working. Far less attention, historically, has gone into what happens on the other side, once accumulation ends and retirement actually begins. That imbalance is precisely why a regulator overseeing the sector has pointed out that retirees collectively entrust hundreds of billions of dollars to super trustees, and why the industry itself is now actively working on proposals to make this transition automatic, rather than optional, recognizing that relying on every individual to independently discover and act on this detail was never going to work for everyone. The real lesson underneath all of this is not really about superannuation phases at all. It is about how often the most expensive financial mistakes in this country are not dramatic, complicated decisions, but simple inaction, multiplied quietly across millions of ordinary people who were never specifically told to do anything differently. Retirement does not automatically reorganize your finances for you. It still requires you, or someone who cares about you, to ask the right question at the right time, and that one conversation can genuinely be worth thousands of dollars over the years that follow. If this helped you think differently about your own super, or about someone in your life who might be sitting on exactly this kind of stranded balance without ever knowing it, that is exactly what this channel exists for. Subscribe if you want these hidden details explained clearly, before they quietly cost you or someone you love, and I will see you in the next one.